Okay, so my topic is age and second language acquisition. To put it in different words, the question is achievement in learning a second language subject to age constraints? To put it yet differently, is it the case that the older we get, the less successful we are in the acquisition of a second language? Now, I'll be using a PowerPoint presentation, so I'll engage my share screen and I'll switch to my PowerPoint slides. It's a big topic. I was probably over ambitious in planning what to present to you. I'll try to keep it under an hour and then give participants a chance to ask me a few questions. You don't have to wait until the end to formulate your questions. I would actually encourage you, as soon as you think of a suitable question, you can type it in the chat area. So by the time I've finished my presentation, I can go into the chat area and answer your questions one after the other. And of course, during the PowerPoint presentation, you'll be most welcome to join in and to interrupt me at any time. If you have specific questions, if you have something that you want clarified, I'll be very happy to do so. So let's do this in a very informal way. So I'll switch you to my share screen. Okay, just bear with me. Okay, getting there. There you go. Okay. Now, age and second language acquisition. These are the points that I'll try to cover as part of my presentation. In the first instance, we'll briefly talk about first language acquisition, and we'll relate this to a very, very popular and influential theory called universal grammar, with which I'm sure all of you are very well familiar. Okay, then we will switch to second language acquisition. More specifically, when we talk about second language acquisition, we'll mean learning a second language in adulthood, not as a child or as an adolescent. And then we'll make comparisons in a way between what happens in first language acquisition and in second language acquisition. And based on this comparison, we will propose a different theory that explains, presumably, what happens in second language acquisition. Visually, this is the so-called fundamental difference hypothesis. Then we'll briefly talk about critical period as a general concept. Then we'll briefly talk about critical period for first language acquisition. And then we finally come to the key issue of this presentation, which is critical period for second language acquisition. We'll examine a number of arguments which, in my view, support the idea that second languages are subject to a biological constraint like a critical period. Then we'll consider a number of arguments that have been proposed against the idea that second language acquisition is subject to a critical period. And finally, we will reassess these negative arguments, as it were, and we'll see that all of them can easily be explained either with reference to the fundamental difference hypothesis or with reference to a general theory of cognitive development, and more specifically, age effects on general cognition. And in the last instance, we'll draw a few inferences and conclusions based on the evidence that we have presented as part of this presentation. So let me go straight into our first point, first language acquisition and universal grammar. Now, when we talk about first language acquisition, when we talk generally about the acquisition of a skill, I think it's very important to frame this issue in terms of three key questions. What is the skill that is being acquired? In this case, this is language. And this is an important question because if it's a very simple or trivial skill, then the question of how this skill is being acquired is relatively uninteresting. Okay, but if it's a very complex skill, very challenging skill, then the question of what happens as part of its acquisition becomes really big proportions. Okay, and the second question is, who is the acquirer? So what is the typical acquirer like? What does this person look like? What kind of properties do they have? And the third question is, how is this skill acquired? So what are the properties of the acquisition process? And so we'll go through all three of these questions briefly. And what we know about language as a type of competence and as a skill is that it involves a very rich and sophisticated communication system, and that it has a number of really complex and intricate properties. We can specifically define two types of properties, what we call categorical properties and what we call structural properties. The categorical properties specifically refer to the fact that different words belong to different word classes like nouns, verbs, prepositions, adjectives, and these are abstract concepts which are not, it is not immediately clear whether a word is a noun or a verb. In fact, many linguists have worked a long time in this area, and there is still not sufficient clarity about the theoretical and methodological ways in which we can comprehensively define all word classes in a language. And pretty much the same applies to the structural properties. It refers to the different ways in which language constituents combine and interact among each other. And we already know that the types of sentences and utterances that we produce, they have this complex internal hierarchical composition. And again, it's not something that is obvious when we look at the sentence or when we hear a sentence. The other thing that's particularly interesting about language is that it is what we can call a creative system. In fact, many think that language is an extraordinarily productive system. What do we mean by that? We mean that every normal speaker has the capacity to produce a theoretically infinite number of new sentences. And we do it as a matter of course, on a daily basis in the way we interact with other speakers. And this is not a comprehensive list by any measure, but we should also mention that our linguistic competence is or constitutes unconscious knowledge. So we are not consciously aware of the various category or structural properties of language. We're not conscious of the internal hierarchical composition of sentences. We just use it in a spontaneous and effortless way without having to think about it. Of course, this last part is actually true about how we acquire and how we use our native languages. Okay, I imagine that all of you are learners and speakers of at least one second language, and we know from experience that we do have plenty of conscious knowledge about the second language. But this is again one of the quite substantial differences between the native language and the second language, and this is something that we'll be going into in just a moment or two. Okay. Now, let's look at what happens in language acquisition. And again, we'll frame it in terms of these three main questions. What is being acquired? Who is the acquirer? And how it is being acquired. So we address the first one. What is being acquired? Language, a big system, a complex system with a number of fairly strange and complex properties. Okay, what do we know about the typical acquirer? About the typical acquirer? Well, first language acquisition happens very early in life. It starts at birth, and it usually is over by the age of 4 or 5. So the typical acquirer is a very young child. What do we know about children at this age? Well, we know that they are still cognitively undeveloped or underdeveloped. So we know from other domains of science, more specifically from cognitive science and psychology, that the typical child only starts to develop more advanced cognitive abilities after the age of 6 or 7. So at the time first language acquisition takes place, the acquirer, which is a young child, doesn't really have an advanced cognitive system. And yet they manage to acquire what is a really complex communication system. Now, what do we know about language acquisition? It happens relatively fast. And when I say fast, the key term here is relative. It does take a few years, but in terms of the complexity and the size of the system and the knowledge that is being acquired, 3 or 4 or even 5 years is quite fast. We know from other domains of cognitive science that for really complex cognitive skills, it can take 10 years or more for the skill to be fully acquired. Okay, one important point or stipulation, I should say, that I should make it at this stage is that when we talk about language acquisition, we're specifically referring to the acquisition of the grammatical system of the language. In other words, we're referring to the acquisition of a set of grammatical rules and grammatical principles, and also a set of grammatical procedures, which we can think of as the engine of the language, this particular engine that gives language its amazing productivity. So the idea is that by the age of 5 or even earlier, quite often even by the age of 4, the child has fully acquired the grammatical system. Okay. If I could request that you mute your microphones, there is some interference coming my way. Thank you very much. Okay. Of course, if you have a question, please switch your microphones and ask your question, or type it in the chat area. Okay, so as well as I was saying, language acquisition is a term specifically referring to the acquisition of the grammatical system. And there are, of course, other language domains, and some of them take much longer. So if we think of the lexical system, for example, it doesn't stop at the age of acquiring the lexical system, doesn't stop at the age of 5. It takes on practically over the lifespan of the speaker to acquire the lexical system. Okay. We also should make a distinction between language, specifically the grammatical system of the language, and other language-related skills like literacy. So literacy is obviously language-based skill, but we acquire it a bit later in life. So we only start to learn our literacy after the age of 6 and 7, and we learn it via formal instruction, usually at school, and we learn it with conscious effort, and it's language related with something different from the grammatical system. What else do we know about language acquisition in childhood? It is remarkably uniform in terms of onset, rate, developmental sequences, and age of completion. What it means in practical terms is that all over the world, regardless of sometimes considerable economic and cultural and geographical and social differences, all children, all normal children start their language acquisition at the same age, and they proceed at approximately the same rate, and they go through approximately the same developmental sequences, and most normal children complete the process by the age of 4 or 5 at the most. Okay. And what research has also shown us that first language acquisition is insensitive to a variety of social and psychological factors like intelligence, motivation, learning strategies, learning goals. Okay. When you think of children, obviously they don't have learning strategies and learning goals, not conscious ones in any case. Motivation is probably not really relevant at this young age, but certainly intelligence is something that that is a factor generally. So it is the case that some babies or some young children are more generally intelligent than others. But regardless of differences in intelligence, they all normal children go through the same language acquisition process, and they all of them go through the same steps and in the same fashion. And this is a very important point. First language acquisition involves 100% success for 100% of all normal participants. And this fact alone makes language acquisition, first language acquisition, a unique process, because there isn't another cognitive domain, there isn't any other form of learning which involves complete success for all normal participants. So this is something that's worth bearing in mind, especially when we come to compare first language acquisition to second language acquisition. Okay. Now, this is also an interesting aspect of first language acquisition. We say, well, the technical term is equipotentiality. What it means is that a baby has the equal potential to acquire any language that they're exposed to, and they'll do this with the same ease, in the same effortless way, and they'll finish within the same time frame. So to give you a basic example, just imagine that a baby is born in, let's say, in Indonesia to Indonesian parents, and then if this child was to grow in these conditions in Indonesia, this child would acquire the Indonesian language of her parents. But then suppose that very early in life, for some reason, this child gets adopted to, let's say, French parents, and they take her to France. Then the same child would acquire French with the same ease and with the same effortlessness as she would have acquired, let's say, Indonesian. Now, having looked at these facts, we can come to a reasonably confident conclusion that first language acquisition is a biologically determined process, and we can relate this to a very influential and very popular linguistic theory called universal grammar, Chomsky's universal grammar, which states that the human mind has a specialized part which is responsible for language acquisition and language use. And this specialized module of the mind contains what we can think of as the most fundamental specifications of human language, the most basic grammatical principles of language, what we call the language universals. And in addition to this, this specialized mental module also contains something like a specialized language acquisition device, which guides the process of first language acquisition. Okay. The other thing that's worth mentioning here is that, again, according to the universal grammar theory, the language competence that we have involves two complementary domains. One of them is what we call universal grammar, or a set of language universals. And these are, as I said, very fundamental grammatical principles that are shared by all human languages, which is why we call them universals. But in addition to this, every human language also has a set of properties, grammatical properties, which are specific to this particular language. And a very simple example is the past tense rule in English. Okay, many languages have a tense system, and they have a past tense and a past tense morpheme. But as far as I know, English is the only language that has this particular past tense morpheme. So it's unique to English. It's a property which is specific to this particular language. So keep this in mind. Okay, we'll have to skip to this because there is a little bit more than we can manage to cover if we go through everything in great detail. Okay, but you have the handout, so you should be able to review this. Okay, now let's switch to adult second language acquisition and see the extent to which it is the same or is different from first language acquisition. Now, we mentioned universal grammar. Universal grammar as a theory arose as a linguistic theory, as a theory explaining the grammatical properties of language and also explaining how we use language, how we generate sentences. Then it evolved also as a theory of first language acquisition. And then subsequently, it also evolved into a theory of second language acquisition. So there is a fairly prominent field within linguistics and within second language acquisition, and also, at least in part, in psychology and education, a number of researchers and experts who hold the view that universal grammar is also responsible for second language acquisition, the same way it is responsible for first language acquisition. And there is merit in this argument because ideally we want to have one and the same theory explaining presumably the same phenomenon rather than have two different theories. But then the question is, are first language acquisition and adult second language acquisition the same phenomenon? And when we compare what happens in either of them, we may come to, or I should probably say, we will come to the conclusion that they're actually characterized by what at least one researcher called fundamental differences. What are these differences? When one is that in contrast to first language acquisition, in second language acquisition, very few learners achieve complete competence in the second language. In first language acquisition, uniformity and homogeneity are among the most defining properties of first language acquisition. In second language acquisition, variation is one of the most defining properties. So we find considerable variation among learners in terms of how much they acquire, in terms of how quickly they learn, in terms of how long it takes them to achieve a particular level of competence. And quite surprisingly, this variation holds even in situations in which a group of learners share a number of personality traits and learned in the same conditions. Even in such situations, there is a lot of variation among individual learners. Again, we find that formal instruction and formal correction take place a lot and help. And the other interesting finding is in relation to so-called equipotentiality. First languages are equipotential, or rather babies are equipotential to any language. This is not the case with second language acquisition. Second language learners find some languages easier to learn than others. And as a consequence, they find some languages harder to learn. As a rule, it all goes down to typological distance between the first language and the second language. So if the learner's native language and the second language are typologically close to each other, learners usually are more successful with such languages. In contrast, learners usually struggle acquiring high level of competence in typologically distant languages. To put this in practical terms, German learners of English are more successful than Russian learners of English, simply because the typological distances between German and English are much smaller than the typological distances between English and Russian. Okay, and then we come to this theory, which is called the fundamental difference hypothesis. It was a person, a guy called Robert Blave-Roman. Your handout has a number of references. The source is in the references, so you're welcome to follow up on these if you're interested. So Blave-Roman proposed that both first and second language acquisition involve two components, as it were, a linguistic knowledge base and a cognitive apparatus, but these differ between first and second language acquisition. So in first language acquisition, the linguistic knowledge base on which language acquisition proceeds is a set of universals, what we call universal grammar, and the cognitive device which is involved is a specialized language acquisition device. In contrast, second language acquisition operates on the basis of the knowledge of the first language. So if universal grammar is the starting point of first language acquisition, the first language is the starting point of second language acquisition, and we use general learning procedures, so our general cognitive apparatus, to learn a second language. And there is a lot of merit in this proposal, because if we looked into depth into what this proposal entails, we will find that it easily explains the differences between first and second language acquisition. Okay, so again, I will not consider this in great detail, simply because we have considerable time pressures on us. But the idea is that this theory explains the differences. Well, this theory, the theory of the fundamental difference hypothesis, is much better equipped to explain what happens in second language acquisition than the theory of universal grammar. Okay, and this is, yeah, very briefly, this is a point that's worth considering for a moment. Okay, so remember what we said about first language acquisition, that it involves 100% success for all participants. Okay, there is no general area of learning that involves 100% success for all learners. in any area of learning, regardless of what it is, regardless whether it's maths or piano or driving or knitting or swimming, there is a small number of learners who achieve very, very poorly, say between 5 and 10%. And there is a very small number of participants who achieve very highly, close to 100%. And the vast majority of learners are somewhere in the middle, which gives us this famous bell-shaped curve of achievements. Okay, and this bell-shaped curve of achievements holds for the learning of maths or chemistry or history or piano. And the situation in second language learning is 100% the same. So this bell-shaped curve of achievement applies with equal strength to second language acquisition. There is a very small number of performers who achieve very poorly. There is a very small number of learners who achieve very highly, close to native competence, and the vast majority of second language learners are somewhere in the middle. Okay, now let's briefly talk about critical periods more broadly, and then we'll talk about critical period again very briefly for first language acquisition, and then we'll spend the rest of the time talking about critical period for second language acquisition. So what is critical period? We can broadly define it as an age-related biological constraint. It's something that is applicable much more broadly, not only in relation to language. In fact, the concept of critical period was out there for other domains much earlier than it came to be considered as relevant to the acquisition of language. In essence, not only with us humans, but also with other species, there are some essential, fundamental life important skills, if I can call them that, which are typically acquired very early in life. And in order to acquire, for the acquisition of this skill to start, the individual or the animal needs to be exposed to a stimulus or to stimuli to trigger the development of the skill. One example is vision. There have been some experiments, I think very cruel experiments, but that was a while ago when people used to do these things. So in one study, they covered the eyes of a newly born kitten, and the eyes remained covered for several months. And when they removed the cover, the cat remained blind. Then it never developed the ability to see, which is explained with reference to critical period. So in order for, in this case, for cats to develop the ability to see, they have to receive visual stimuli immediately after birth or in the first weeks and months after birth. So failure to receive these stimuli then as a consequence then leads to the inability to to develop this skill. And it has been proposed that the same happens with primary languages, or what primary language is another term for first language, for the native language. Okay, that the first language is also subject to a biological constraint, and that young children need to be exposed to at least some language input in order to start to trigger the acquisition process and for acquisition to proceed successfully. Okay. There's been a lot of research on critical period since the middle of the 20th century. The start of this research is associated with the names of these researchers, Penfield and Roberts, but particularly famous is Eric Lenneberg's book called Foundations of Language, Biological Foundations of Language. Okay. Now, again, we won't have time to go in great detail through different pieces of evidence supporting the idea that first languages are subject to a biological constraint like critical period. Okay. This is something that deserves a brief mention because it bears directly to the idea of critical periods. Okay. Language acquisition by linguistically isolated children, they sometimes are known as the feral children, children who, especially in the past, like usually hundreds of years ago, children that were abducted by wild animals and raised in social isolation. And there have been probably, as far as I remember, around 50 such cases documented in literature, spanning over several centuries. But perhaps, I'm not sure it's the most recent case, but a relatively recent case is the case of Jeannie, a very unfortunate girl, and that was in the, I think, in the 60s of the previous century, if I remember correctly, whose father was insane, and he kept her when from the time she was 2 years old. He kept her completely isolated in a dark room and never spoke to her, and always punished her when she even produced any sound. And she spent in these conditions, like, I think 12 years, and she was about 14 when she was discovered, and she had absolutely no language. And then in the following years, there were whole research teams around her, consisting of psychologists and educators and other medical people. And there was some there was a team of linguists whose task was specifically to teach her some language, and they completely failed. Okay, so that happened after she was 14 years old, presumably by then outside of the critical period. Okay, and again, these are all interesting and worth some attention and some consideration, but we don't really have time to go through all of them, so you'll be welcome to follow up on them if you're interested. Okay, but based on the evidence that we have, we can confidently state that first language acquisition is subject to a biologically based age constraint, a critical period, which limits the ability to acquire the first language to the period between birth and around the onset of puberty. Okay. Now, what happens in second language acquisition? Okay, now we should start by pointing out that regardless of the fact that we have established that there is a critical period for first language acquisition, it doesn't necessarily follow that there is a critical period for adult second language acquisition. In fact, there are two opposing views, what we call the exercise hypothesis and the maturational state hypothesis. And the exercise hypothesis states that once this language ability has been triggered and exercised as part of first language acquisition, then this language ability that we call universal grammar remains operational throughout life, and it is again responsible for what takes place in the acquisition of second languages. And there is the other hypothesis that we call the maturational state hypothesis, which states that once utilized, universal grammar or this specialized language ability becomes irrelevant and gradually, after the onset of puberty, gradually fades away. Now let's consider some of the arguments that are proposed in favor of a critical period for second language acquisition. Okay, so again, this is something that we discussed with reference to the fundamental difference hypothesis. Highly variable. Okay. Lack of achievements. Okay. One would think that if universal grammar was in charge of second language acquisition, we'll have the same situation as we find in first language acquisition. Everyone will achieve native competence within 3 or 4 years, and we know that this doesn't happen. Also, this is something that we find in second language acquisition, which has the disagreeable term of fossilization. Fossilization refers to the fact that with the vast majority of second language learners, there comes a point that the learning stops. So this person may receive further input, further second language input. They may continue their efforts to learn more, but learning has stopped and their level of competence is in a way frozen to the current level and doesn't move forwards. Okay. Now, this is something that often comes up in the debate on critical periods. We know, and no one disputes this, that younger children are almost always much more successful in acquiring the second language than adult learners. Okay. Now, this is a very interesting study. It's an older study. It probably was published 50 years ago, so if I remember correctly. It's worth briefly describing what the study involved. So it was a study of the phonological competence of English of immigrants in the United States. So they recruited a number of second language learners of English, immigrants to the United States. they divided them into 3 groups. Those who arrived in the United States between the ages of 6 and 10, those who arrived between the ages of 11 and 15, and those who arrived between the ages of 16 and 20. And they collected spoken sample in English from all participants. So they asked them to say something in English, several sentences, to read several sentences. They recorded these samples, and then they played the samples to a panel of native speaker judges. And I asked the native speakers to rate each sample, to give each sample rating between 1 and 5 according to how strong the foreign accent of the sample was. So there, the instruction was rate the sample as 1 if it has no foreign accent. So if it sounds like a native speaker, give it a rating of 1. If it has a very heavy accent, give it the rating of 5. And these are the results that they came up with. So as you can see, the 6 to 10 group, so the youngest arrivals, in other words, the people who were very young when they were first exposed to English, okay, the rating came very close to native, very close to 1. And then there is a distinct shift to upwards towards heavier accent with 11 to 15, and an even greater shift to as you can see, almost 372 for the 16 and 20, between 16 and 20 year-old group. Okay. The other thing that this researcher checked was whether the length of residence was somehow a factor affecting the ability to acquire a native accent. Excuse me. Okay, so as you can see, again, they divided participants into 2 groups. Those who spent between 12 and 18 years in the United States, and those who spent between 5 and 11 years. As you can see, this particular criterion played almost no role. In fact, as you can see, with the oldest group, those who stayed in the United States longer, 12 to 18 years, had a heavier accent than those who'd been there much shorter time. Okay. Now, not everyone agrees with the arguments that we have presented here, and they have presented a number of counter arguments, and we'll run through these very quickly. I'm mindful that we're running out of time. Okay, so what critics of the idea of critical period for second language acquisition would say is that, yes, it is true that adult language learners do not achieve very highly, but they do achieve some. So they do manage to learn some, and they're saying if the acquisition of second languages was subject to a biological constraint like critical period, it would be impossible to learn any of the second language, which is, I think, a reasonable point to make. Okay. Then there have been a small number of studies which have managed to show rare cases. When I say rare, I should say extremely rare cases in which someone who only started learning the second language as an adult learner managed, nevertheless, to achieve complete mastery in second language. So they manage presumably to achieve native competence in the second language. And again, the very existence of such cases, regardless of the fact that they're very rare, presumably invalidates critical period when it is defined as a biological constraint. And again, this is a serious argument that needs to be taken into consideration. The other thing that they say is that, yes, it's true that statistically children outperform adults, but they say it doesn't prove anything. It's just a statistical generalization, and it proves nothing about the existence of a critical period. Okay, now this is a bit technical. There was one study conducted by Johnson and Newport, which examined grammatical and syntactic competence among second language learners of English. Again, if I remember correctly, and it's been a while since I read this paper, it was with immigrants in America. And when they analyzed the results statistically, they found this picture. So you can see between the ages of 3 and 7, it stays level. In other words, they all achieve very highly native competence. Okay, so those who arrived between 3 and 7, level, native competence, and then it starts dropping quite markedly. So there is a steep decline, as you can see afterwards, and it goes down and down and down until you can see the level of achievement is really, really low. But then these two researchers, who are very famous in their own right, they decided to reanalyze the data of the Johnson and Newport study. But this is what we sometimes do in science generally. It's a good thing to do. And they came up with a completely different graph. Now, I'm not a statistician. In fact, I'm very incompetent in the field of statistics. So I'm not in a position to evaluate the merits or the validity of either of these analyses, but I'm sure that each of them deserves to be taken seriously and given consideration. But as you can see, the results, the pictures we get after the Bialystok and Hakuto reanalysis is strikingly different from the results, from the pictures we get in the original Johnson and Newport studies. So what we find here is a little bit more dispersion, but generally a very gradual decline from one point to another, nothing like the steep decline that we get here. And the other notable finding in the study was that not all grammatical structures of the second language were sensitive to these age-related constraints or short age-related effects. Only grammatical structures of the second language which were different from corresponding grammatical structures of the first language showed age-related effects. And these two researchers say, again, very reasonably, if this was all the result of a biological constraint, a biological constraint is not selective in terms of which structures, which grammatical structures it will affect. It will affect everything across the board. Okay. And now we come to our final section. Thank you for listening so patiently. We're nearly finished. Okay. Now, what can we do about these counter arguments that were raised by prominent researchers like Bialystok and Hakuta, among others, they're not the only ones. Well, each of their counter arguments can be explained very successfully by reference to the fundamental different hypothesis that we introduced a little bit earlier. Okay, so some learning does take place in second language acquisition. Why? Because learners use the general problem solving abilities. So we're saying universal grammar is no longer accessible. It's faded away. It's disappeared. Okay, but the learners have their first language and they have general cognitive system, and they use the general cognitive system to learn the second language. Okay, now the other contentious issue is the existence, and I say arguable existence of rare cases of complete mastery of the second language. Okay, I remain, at least to some extent, skeptical that is 100% complete. It's probably 99%. I doubt that anyone ever, an adult learner ever achieves 100% completely equivalent to a corresponding native speaker of the language. Okay, but that's beside the point, because we know that these cases are extremely rare, and we know from the research that describes them that their success was largely due to factors which are relevant to general learning, like extreme commitment and motivation. Okay, so which are completely irrelevant to first language acquisition, by the way. So those who presumably achieved complete competence in second language, native competence, they did so, but by very, very strong efforts and commitment and very hard work over a large period of time. And quite possibly factors like typological distance and what was I going to say? Sorry. Well, definitely typological distance. Okay, because, for instance, one of the studies specifically concerns Dutch learners of English, and Dutch and English are probably as close typologically as any two languages on earth. Okay. Now, you see, when we looked at these graphs here, they're different in a number of respects, but they're similar in the fact that achievement goes down in parallel with age. So the older we get, the less successful we are in learning the second language, regardless of whether it's steep decline or more gradual. It is unfortunately a decline. Okay, how do we explain this? Well, there is a general theory of aging which shows, and this is undisputed, it's accepted as established science, which shows that human beings' cognitive ability gradually declines with age. So once we get to about 20 years of age, this is where our ability for learning peaks, and then afterwards it gradually declines, which explains the orientation of these graphs here, unfortunately. Okay, and very briefly at the end, what conclusions can we draw from the arguments that we have presented here? We can state with a high degree of confidence, as far as I'm concerned, that like first language acquisition, second language acquisition is subject to an age constraint, and that the critical period during which language acquisition is successful is between the ages of between birth and approximately the onset of puberty, and then the critical period closes off and our ability to acquire a new language successfully declines. Okay, it doesn't mean that we can't learn quite a bit, but we can never be as successful as if we started learning very early on. So a very important message to second language learners, that was probably even more important to parents, is that the ideal time to start learning a second language is before the age of 7. And in order to acquire a really high level of competence, even native competence second language, we need to have early exposure and then a regular and continuous exposure to the second language. Okay. And yes, second language acquisition is subject to an age constraint, but because we have our first language and because we have our general cognitive system, we can still acquire varying degrees of competence in the second language, and we can acquire a very high level of competence, but this would involve consistent efforts over a number of years, including exposure to second language instruction. And thankfully, this brings me to the end of my exposition, and I would like to thank you very much for listening to me so patiently, and apology for taking a bit longer than I had promised. But now I can actually pause this